Yay! I've got a little sign that says I've gone live, which I assume means that we are saying hello to everybody. And so it's extremely nice to see that there are all sorts of people in this Google chat webinar. I'm Sue Parnell, and you've had a chance to have a look and listen to some of the sessions on urban theory and urban history. And so this is an opportunity for us to pick up on some of those issues and to engage a little with each other on that. I've got some questions that you've already sent in, and they are fantastic. And so it's probably easiest if I just start with some of those. But to tell you that I'm sitting in Cape Town, where it's very hot, and as I'm looking at who's online, I'm extremely aware that people are coming from very different cities, in different time zones, and have got quite diverse questions. But I think given what we're trying to talk about in the next little while, that's really useful. And Maya Davidson asked an interesting question for me, because she said, basically, how do we juggle the tension between what is unique and what is general? And it's probably one of the hottest topics in the study of cities at the moment, and it's partly there because the Sustainable Development Goals have, for the first time, set one general framework for what we need to strive for in order to make cities sustainable. In other words, there's a sense that there's a common goal, whether you're sitting in kind of Oslo or whether you're sitting in some kind of very small town in Bangladesh. And of course, that's quite tricky, because of course we all instantly go, well, things are very, very different, and how do we account for those differences? And there are going to be quite a lot of politics around that in the SDG process. The reason that they did that was because there was a real sense that what happened in one city had implications for everybody. And so that's that logic of leave no city behind. But for us conceptually, there's another reason why there's this question of what's unique and what's general are very important to deal with. And it really has to do with the idea that for some people, theory is something that is quite abstract, and it informs how we understand and undertake empirical work. And so there are some very general points, and one would expect then for there to be very similar explanations, very similar processes, very similar dynamics that take place in every city. The tension, of course, is that whenever we start getting down into the detail, the first thing that we'll end up saying is, oh, but that's not like this in my city, or in African cities, we don't see industrialization of the kind that people talk about as being a general characteristic of cities. And so what Maya was asking is how do I straddle this stuff? How do I engage with both the idea that there are some big common ideas and some specifics? And the short answer is that there is no easy way. But what I would encourage you to do, and what I think is a good thing for all of us to do, is to know as much and be as in-depth in a context where we are either living or where we are working and undertaking fairly extensive research. And to be reading that city from multiple different ways. In other words, you look at, and I talked about sort of the cultural and the environmental and the economic. So you know quite a lot, I think, and the more we know about one place, the better. In other words, the more substantive our grounding is in the particularities of a place. Quite often when people speak from a particular example, they're not just talking about a particular place, they're only talking about a little piece of a particular place. And quite often when you know a bit more, either over a longer time frame, in other words, you understand it may not be like that now, but it was 2 or 3 decades ago, that really helps. So that's, or it's like that in this part of the city, but not in other parts of the city. So the more you know about one place, I think the easier it is to work out whether something really is very distinctive and particular, or whether it's a blip in a wider sort of pattern. So that's the first thing. But the second thing I found really interesting is the idea that we read about other places. I mean, I suppose ideally that we visit other places, because there is something extraordinary about seeing and being in other cities, where the act of observation becomes a very rich way of absorbing. But we don't all have the luxury of being able to do that. And just looking for really good footage, and YouTube really has got now fantastic footage of lots of different kinds of places, not just the cities that are in the movies. And if one can read about those places, get a sense of the scale, get a sense of, go and get onto Google Street Maps and go and kind of walk those cities, I think you begin to learn a language for seeing cities. And it's a little bit, I think, like languages, where the more you speak, the easier it is to acquire others, and the more you understand the similarities and the differences in the structure and the dynamics and the evolution of them. So, but don't lose that tension between what's unique and what's general, because it's one of the enduring sort of themes, if you like, of urban studies. And that really relates to a second question that somebody asked, which was really about the sense of scale and how do I deal with, and I have your name written down and I can't, now I'm juggling not just a new pair of glasses, but also two instruments to see whose question is it. I'll come back to it in a second. It's the issue, though, of how do we juggle the question of scale when we're trying to understand cities, because quite a lot of studies are very based on a neighborhood. And typically what you'll find is that neighborhoods are quite easy to study, and when we're starting out, they are useful for us to study because it's clear who the respondents are, we can get a lot of information about it. The kinds of layering, which I'm going to come back to in a second, it's possible, you know. You actually can see these very different sorts of things that are going on. So, but neighborhood scales don't tell you everything that you need to know, and quite a lot of the processes that happen, which change the form, which lead to the kinds of transitions that we are really trying to get to, you know, big energy transitions, or much more effective water demand management, or the reduction in poverty. These aren't things that you can control at a neighborhood scale. They're things you can mitigate at a neighborhood scale. They're things you can manage around, but the real drivers of change are very rarely at a neighborhood scale. That doesn't mean that the neighborhood scale is unimportant. And one of the places where the neighborhood scale is the most useful site of analysis is when we're actually testing what policies mean in practice, because quite often policies are devised at a city or even a national scale, but what they mean in practice just doesn't work out in some places. And so those neighborhood studies are fantastic for grounding, assessing, reflecting on how effective policy is. But if you are trying to get to the sort of grand transition that we are talking about at the moment, and this really is what the Sustainable Development Goals are trying to do. They're trying to do something which is ambitious. It's incredibly ambitious. We're trying to say that the entire way we run cities has got to shift. Then we need neighborhood studies, but we need much more significant work as well. And that takes us to the question then of, well, what's that all about? And this issue of what is the city and what is the dynamic of the city is what is quite overwhelming. And Singh asked a really interesting question about that. Just about what is the city? How do I access this complexity? We'll come back to that in a second. But before we do that, I just want to finish talking a little bit more about this idea of scale, because most work on cities has to be multi-scalar. It has to have a neighborhood lens. It has to look at what goes on, let's call it at the local authority scale. Sometimes it's at the metropolitan scale, sometimes both. But any serious work on the city cannot ignore what we might think of as the city regional, or the functional region sometimes people talk about. And that's the stuff where people are looking at, what's the sphere of influence? Where are the resources that come from the outside in? There might be people, there might be money, there might be water, it might be food. And what's the impact of the city back out? Again, either through remittances or through pollution or through just connectivity, you know, people coming in with commuting. And I think what makes for really good understandings of cities is when we have people who can straddle those different scales. I live in a country that has quite a high level of devolution. Some of you are in countries where there's almost no devolution. In other words, what happens in a city is really dictated by national government. But in every country, even in countries where there's a very high level of devolution, national government makes extraordinarily important kinds of interventions into the city. And so that question of scale is, when we say urban policy, quite often urban policy is set by National Treasury, okay, from the Ministry of Finance, if you like, because whether that's on macroeconomic policy or whether that's on something else, actually the national policy frame is one that is absolutely fundamental to what happens in the city. So the question of scale, okay, so there's no, the short answer is you can't only do one scale. You here not meaning an individual, but in order to understand a city and its city systems, typically what happens is different people are able to have expertise, and you learn to be quite respectful of people who have expertise in scales other than the one where you are known to be an expert. So if you are a local expert, best you listen carefully when people speak about national processes. Doesn't mean you have to do everything. Similarly, if you are the kind of person who is working for a national department, many of you will end up involved in national urban policies. That becomes an area, it's a totally legitimate area of expertise, but you also want to be listening very carefully to what people in your neighboring countries are saying, because your city system is related to theirs, and to what the global debates are. But similarly, you want to have a real handle on what's going on at the local level. Okay, so scale. So far we've had a look at one general question about whether cities are unique or whether they are general, and we said that there was a tension and you had to hold on to the tension. The second area that people have raised is this question about scale, and here we're not so much saying that it's a tension, but we're saying that it's a little bit like a layering, where you really need to have serious expertise in the different layers, and some people will become particularly good at understanding the connectivity between those scales. Because sometimes it's important to understand that although things appear very far away, they're very important and very big. Other times it's much less, it's outside noise, and local dynamics are what is really key. So developing a capacity to read across scales. The idea of the multi-scalar city that Neil Brenner talks about, I think really, really useful as a general way of thinking about the city, and probably good idea for people to think about where they want to develop a niche, if you like, and to look at other people in other countries and in other cities who have a similar kind of niche. And you'll see that some journals have a tendency to local information. Okay, the journal Cities, for example, quite often has very local kinds of politics. Whereas a journal like Environment and Planning A has a tendency to focus on the big questions. Okay, those are two. There are lots of questions coming in, and so I'm going to keep moving. But Shahazad asked a very particular question about the literature on exclusion, and then I'm going to jump from that to the work on the right to the city, because there's a little bit of a relationship. So Simone and Pamela and Baglaka, I'm coming to some of those questions there. Shahzad's question was, can you say more about the specific theoretical ideas which underpin the idea of exclusion? And that's important because, and why I like the question, is that exclusion is actually something which we think instinctively, at least in the English language, that we know what it means. And where the theoretical literature, I think, has been good is that it's helped us identify quite different ideas about exclusion. And because the ideas are very different, and you'll remember I talked about this in the chapter, when we have different ideas, we quite often also land up with a different emphasis when it comes to implementation. So let me give you some examples. First of all, there is quite a significant difference in the literature about social exclusion, okay, how people are marginalized, kept out, sometimes unintentionally, and I'll give you an example of that, because of who they are, either because of their race, their gender, their language. But it's a very European idea, this idea of social exclusion. And it came out of a literature which was really looking at why people didn't get the benefits that they were intended to get and for which they were actually eligible, something like the National Health Service in the UK. And what they found was that even though people were theoretically entitled to something, they either self-excluded, in other words, they didn't feel they were able to attend or go or claim that, or they were kept out through some other mechanism that hadn't been thought about. So, for example, a lot of Muslim women were not going and getting the healthcare treatment that they were entitled to, either because the doctors were men and seeing them on their own, or because the doctors didn't speak the language of the patient community. So that was that idea about social exclusion. It's about stigma, it's about prejudice, it's about the marginal, unintended, if you like, or sometimes intended, but not legal, not endorsed ideas of exclusion. That's a very different idea from the idea of economic exclusion, okay, which simply means you can't pay. And the policies which come into play on economic exclusion would be things like, in a city, you would hope that people would be able to partake in a sanitation system because it's in a collective interest, whether even just from health, forget about any other kinds of moral questions, that everybody has access to a toilet. But not everybody can afford a toilet, okay? And so quite often cities will subsidize that, or they will subsidize the provision of water, or at least to a minimal amount. And that's because people are too poor to access a good like water, access to water. It's not just for poor people. Quite often cities will put in place public transport systems that have a subsidy associated with that. And that's to ensure that nobody is unable to get to work or to get to participate in the city because of cost. So that's economic exclusion, has a set of particular implications. I live in a country where we talk a lot as South Africans about spatial exclusion. The Americans also do. We're not the only cities in the world that are highly spatially segregated, but the idea of spatial exclusion is a very area-based idea. In other words, it's the idea that because of where you live, North America, they talk about ghettos. Some of the literature will talk about spatial mismatch, the mismatch between where people live and where they get work. But it's a very geographical idea of exclusion. And those are three very different ways that the idea of exclusion takes place. They don't contradict each other, but depending on where you put your emphasis, so your policies would have a very different kind of nuance. Just one thing to add on to that, which I think is a little different and useful. I was very struck years ago when somebody pulled out the difference for me, and it's related to the idea of exclusion, of the idea that we often talk about when people are excluded, it's they help each other. Okay, migrants, we quite often talk about migrant communities who help each other. And that's seen as a way of bonding, sometimes called bonding capital or social capital. And the idea is that you can get over your exclusion by hanging out with your mates, by leaning on people from your home village, from joining a church group or a mosque, or some bonding with other women. And that kind of social capital was for a very long time seen as something which should be promoted, which would lead to an overcoming of exclusion. There's been a bit of a critique of that. And now people point out, of course, that when you are excluded, for example, from the workforce, the last thing you need is to hang out with other unemployed people. What you actually need is what's now called bonding capital. You need to be able to be linked to people who have got connections of the kind that you have not got. So it's a way to just sort of think about this thing and to break down what you mean by exclusion, and therefore what the policies might be. And perhaps a little bit like what we talked about earlier, that you have these sort of layers where you want to talk about some policies which deal with social exclusion, some with economic exclusion, and some with spatial, or depending on what your mandate is, where you focus on one rather than the other. So I hope that makes sense. I said that I'd try and link that to the literature on the right to the city. And somebody said here, I think it's Simone, could you outline the theoretical development of the right to the city movement and who are the most important scholars? I can. It's going to be a shorthand, and my account of this, I think, is one that you need to flesh out through some further and more substantial reading. And I can't tell from your name what language you speak, but I suspect that the right to the city, I know that the right to the city is something which is a term that is understood slightly differently if you speak English, Portuguese, or French. And perhaps even if you speak Chinese, where there is in fact the notion of a right to the city. Okay, so it's a really important area, and it's an important area both in philosophical terms, because what the right to the city, which was eventually included in the New Urban Agenda in a muted kind of way, does is that it shifts our understanding of what was just a universal right, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it gives a very particular urban application. Now, what the difficulty is that there are quite different understandings about the right to the city. And this makes things awkward for policymakers, because whereas lots of people put their hands up and say, yes, I believe in the right to the city, when push comes to shove, they don't necessarily mean the same thing. So here are some of the differences, and I'm going to make them sound even more different than they perhaps have to be, because I think it sharpens our understanding of the distinctions. So Lefebvre, who's a French theorist, wrote about the right to the city in the 1960s. And it's probably one of the most influential bodies of work. It's also extremely vague. Partly, I think, because of bad translation, but also because the way that he wrote, maybe even the reason that he's had so much traction, is that it's not sharp and crisp. Okay, and in essence, to make something cleaner and sharper than I think Lefebvre ever meant it to be, a Lefebvrean understanding of the right to the city is of a sense of personal, political, psychological entitlement, of citizenship. Okay, I feel like I belong. I feel like it's okay. I am part of this place. I don't feel alienated from it. I don't feel barred from it. I don't feel excluded, to go back to our discussion about exclusion and social exclusion. So the right to the city is, in a sense, for Lefebvre, the inversion of what we talk about as social exclusion. And if you take a Lefebvrean idea, it's quite an abstract idea. In other words, it's as important that there's a sense, it's not literal. Okay, you don't get a passport to the city, literally. Okay, as you do in China. Okay, you get a right to the city, or as you do in Cuba, you get a right to live in a city. So that's a very clear example of a distinction. There's also the second kind of cluster, or the third. So we've got the Lefebvrean idea, the very literal administrative idea from China or Cuba. And then the third really big body of work comes out of the Brazilian experience and the Latin American experience more generally. And this is the sort of late 20th, early 21st century idea of the right to the city. It kind of nods to Lefebvre, but it's a much more legalistic understanding. Okay, and it's very powerful as a result of that. And basically what the Brazilians did, so this is Saul's work, and others who come out of Brazil, and I think their work is really influential, is what they said is actually neighborhoods which were not recognized, in other words, they were not seen as legal, therefore they didn't have proper infrastructure, therefore they were not upgraded, they were not consolidated, had to be acknowledged, had to be formalized. And this speaks to the question of informality and consolidation. It speaks to the issue of recognition. So there's the parallel with Lefebvre, recognition, but it's a different kind of recognition, if you like. Here's a very legal understanding of recognition. And the Latin American case is tied up with a change in the law, with a statute that recognizes that. It's a very legal thing. So that's sort of understanding. Then Edgar and Peterson and I have done a bit of work, and others have also, and maybe Paglata, this might fit in with your question about ecological exclusion and the rise of sort of a political ecology understanding of the city, where people said your right to the city is not just a right which is based on your right to land, i.e. property, housing, okay, or even your right to the services of a city, transportation, and some of the things which are talked about in the Brazilian case, but also your right to all of the benefits and the ecological benefits of the city. And again, the inverse of this is this idea of where some of the work on political ecology came from, which is about people of environmental justice. Okay, so you can sort of see these things, they all get to the question of what's fair, they all speak to the question of what is the public good, they all speak to the question of the city. Now, what I find really interesting about the literature on the right to the city, and it ties in to the question, and really difficult question that Singh has put to us, which is about this thing about the complexity of the city. Okay, so the smaller our understanding of exclusion is, the smaller our understanding of the right to the city is, the easier it is to deal with. But when we start to say, oh, it's very complicated and it means all of these things, and there's something about the way that they all come together, just gets quite difficult and overwhelming. And part of what I've been trying to say to you is to say, break it down, break it down. Look at the links between the bits, but break it down. So acknowledge the tension between the universal and the particular. Look at the links between the neighborhood scale and the other kinds of scales. Understand different kinds of exclusion. Don't try to do everything, but see how yours relates to something else. And so the question that Singh's put to us is to say, I'm doing a PhD. It's unbelievably difficult to deal with this complex system called the city. can you actually try to just outline some basic methods that enable me to get to grips with this complexity? And I think that's a hell of a useful way to come to this. And why I think this is so important is at this moment in urban studies, partly because of the Sustainable Development Goals, and partly because I think there's a general shift away from the individual, which was associated with post-structuralism, back into a broader attempt to understand either political ecology, partly because of climate change, or political economy, because we're in this austerity and the political crisis that is so evident in different parts of the world. There's definitely a shift back to try and understand the slightly more macro picture. And it's within that context that we are seeing the argument, which sometimes gets summarized as seeing like a city, a play on Stott's seeing like a state. Asher Min and Nigel Thrift have just put a new book out on that, building on an earlier work which uses that term. But it is this idea that the city itself is this pathway of change, and that the city is a site where lots of things come together, and it is a transformative space. Okay, and so I think it's in that context that we've got this question of, yeah, I get it. I see the complexity of the complexity. I understand that cities are a melting pot. I see that they are catalytic of everything, but how do I methodologically begin to unpack that? How do I get into this kind of complexity? Good question. And for those of us who live in what I like to think of as messy cities, and that's not a negative description of them, but they're not neat, you know, you can't see who's who. It's not apparent who's in control. There isn't fantastic information. It's quite difficult to be able to do that. How do we begin to do that? And this is where I come back to the question of history. And I try to learn from historians, because I think historians are reasonably good, probably better, even than complex systems modelers, at working out how to begin to unpick the layers and the relationships that make up a city. So the methods, to answer your question very directly, the methods that historians use, which I think are generally applicable. In other words, you don't have to go back into the 1800s to use historical methods. They have some general methods, and there's a fabulous project that the Carnegie Foundation is funding on the role of the humanities in urban studies. And it's, I think, this idea that we want to keep the focus and the skills of the humanities to work with those hard scientists who are getting into complex systems modeling. So the skills that historians use, that it seems to me, are quite useful, and I've been doing that in some of our work on urban risk, and trying to understand why African cities are so badly exposed to risk, funded by the ESRC. And so their methods, like, they talk about narrative. Can you tell the story? Okay, and it's not easy to tell a coherent story if you don't know what's going on, and finding a storyline that makes sense. So the first methodological technique is one of narrative. And particularly for these cities that we do not understand, where the narrative is not known, where it has not been repeated so long. We all know the history of New York, we all know the history of London, but we certainly do not all know the history of, you know, the secondary cities of China or Russia. So narrative is the first thing. I find it quite helpful to draw up timelines, which are quite literal sometimes. So I draw up different timelines. I draw up a timeline for big events that happened in the world, which might have impacted on the city. The Second World War, the financial crisis of 2008, you know, big things. New World Trade Agreement things. And then I have some national things, like, you know, when do different governments come into power and why. But they're not just general timelines. I try to make them very specific to things that I think actually really do impact on a particular city. So, for example, when we had the fiscal crisis of 2008, what does that do to interest rates, and why does that affect the city? It makes building more expensive, or it means people can't get loans. It has very real implications. So try and be specific. And I think you can do that. And again, you can use those scales. You can do timelines for things at different scales, which is what I'm implying. So national governments change and certain things happen. What happens at a city level? Oh, suddenly we get a different kind of government, and it's in opposition to the national government. That's really useful. So timelines. It's also really, really helpful to look at mapping. And mapping can be physically, just the geographical space, to make sure you understand the parts of the city and how they connect, but also just who are the institutional players. Can you actually, who runs the city? Can you map that? Is it the mafia? Is it the city council? Is it the people themselves? So mapping who's who and what they do and what they have control over is useful. And then the thing which historians are use most often is this idea of periodizing. And why it's helpful for urbanists, I think, is what they're looking for there is, when do things break and why? When do things shift and why? And quite often the argument is that historians make is that it doesn't shift for a particular reason. It shifts because multiple things come together. So if you've mapped out all these other kinds of events to tell your story, you realize that there are 2 or 3 stories that are happening simultaneously, and then suddenly they come together. And that's when you get a shift. So for example, there's a big push for climate change, nobody gets anywhere, you suddenly get a new mayor, you have an enormous flood, and you get a fiscal crisis, and those 3 things come together, and you're able to fundamentally change the way infrastructure is put in place. Okay, be the kind of example. And that's sort of what historians do. They look for those shifts and those changes. And there are lots of others, techniques which they use. They look for the difference of the so-called big man, and they do talk about men. Theory of history versus the common social history, the history from below. And I think those things really play out. So for me, we can learn an awful lot on that. Okay, give me a second because I want to have a sip of water. Thank you. Pibby is asked, do you feel that the cities which are more inclusive are also more resilient? And which, in your opinion, are these cities, and can you name a few and why? Ooh, good, big question. Okay, and then similarly attached to that, Shweta's asked, what are the roles of civil society organizations, and can they act as solutions to the problem of exclusion and empowerment of cities? Let's look at so the big, we know that we've got tensions between inclusivity, resilience, and I'm using resilience in a generally accepted way. There are some people who have problems with the concept of resilience because I think it doesn't deal adequately with power. But I think we're going to use it to answer this question as I think you are intending it, which is really about cities which have an ecological resilience and an ability to jump back in the context of stress and exposure to risk. And the question is how does that relate to the question of inclusivity? So look, the famous case on this is New Orleans, one of the most unequal cities in the US, one of the cities where we know that the poor are least able to actually help themselves in particular kinds of ways because they are, to go back to our stuff on exclusion, spatially marginalized, economically marginalized, and socially marginalized because of questions of race and power. And there's no question that those kinds of cities have a much, much more difficult time jumping back after experiences of hazards. Haiti would be another example where it's been extraordinarily difficult. In the Haiti case, I think there's an additional point where the institutions were so weak. And it's something that we don't often focus on. So I suppose to answer your question, Pivia, about what do I think the relationship is, I don't think it's just a two-way relationship between exclusion and resilience. It does seem to me that we can have relatively equal places, but the difference in how robust the institutions are makes an enormous difference. So New Zealand after this earthquake, or Japan after the earthquake, with very robust institutions, both civil society and state institutions, much easier to jump back than somewhere like Haiti. So I don't think it's an either or, and the difficulty, of course, is that quite often the things which shock a city are not citywide. So we tend to focus on the big exposure to risk, big earthquake, whereas actually quite often it's the little risks that are really difficult there, and those are really problematic. Yeah, hope that is helpful. Somebody's asked about, Shweti asked about the role of civil society organizations. I'm going to say something provocative here, and you may or may not agree with what I'm going to say. So Shweti's question was, what are my views on the role of civil society organizations? Now Shweta, it depends for me where you come from, okay? So if you are living in a place like Kinshasa, in the DRC, you have to depend on civil society organizations. There is no alternative. And for me, that's quite difficult. So unlike somewhere like Germany, or an example I know quite well, the UK, where there's a relatively strong state, and the role of civil society is different. It is absolutely crucial. So civil society holds the state to account. And there I think it's imperative to maintain and hold civil society. South Africa, we are absolutely dependent at the moment on our civil society holding the state to account. And we are hanging on in many respects against corruption, against incompetence, against the inability to deliver on a political mandate, and civil society is fundamental in that process. But here's the provocative part, and you may not agree. It seems to me that the lesson of the last decade has been that we underestimate the power of the state, and the importance of the state in the long-term delivery of stability. And the fact that the left in general, perhaps not even just the left, perhaps it's all sides of the political spectrum, have abandoned their engagement with the state, partly because they've focused on building civil society organizations and they've depended on civil society organizations, means that the role of civil society, not as a service provider, but as in holding the state to account, has been forgotten. So do I think that civil society is important? Absolutely, but not necessarily as a service provider. And the difficulty for me is that in the context of many poor countries, we depend almost completely on faith-based organizations, on women's groups, on youth groups to deliver services. And in that process, we've lost the idea that civil society has a different kind of role, which is on holding the state to account. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I hope so, and perhaps people will come back. Shirag wants to know about race and privilege, and how that plays out in segregating parts of the city, and the general question of gentrification. You're asking a South African. You're asking a privileged white South African. Look, one of my pet points about theory and perhaps about history is that we pay too much attention to questions of poverty reduction and not enough attention to questions of inequality. Because of course there are two sides of the same coin, okay? And privilege is something that lives on, and it particularly lives on in the urban context because it gets embedded in the built form, okay? And the most obvious example of this is South Africa. There are many others, but this is a parody of what happens, where because of privileged allocations of property, particularly in the city, people make a lot of money. Okay, you make money. Value capture, talk about the economic theories of the city, value capture. You make money because the property that you are in, the state's put in a railway station nearby, or there's been a shopping mall built down the road by private sector development, the value of your house goes up. You make a lot of money, you pass it on to your children. Your children continue to live in the best part of the city, located next to the station and next to the shopping mall, and you have more money, and you probably haven't been taxed properly. And you got that almost certainly on account of some random allocation of the pigment of your skin or your caste or your who your parents happen to be. So cities, I think, more than anywhere else, beg us to, and the gentrification literature does that to some extent, but what the gentrification literature does not do properly, in my view, is to look at the question of inheritance and inheritance tax. And so I think the relationship between that intergenerational transfer is one which is really key there. So, Krishna, you've asked a very different kind of question. So if we can just kind of shift to that, and it's important because it's about a different kind of urban space. So Krishna says, how are the peri-urban areas sensitive to the kinds of policies in cities, and how can we include them in the focus on sustainable development? Really, really important question, and it's important for a number of different reasons. It's important because, okay, this is generating, I think there are three main reasons why this question for me is important. Peri-urban areas tend to be smaller settlements, okay? And they are, we know, the most important in the sense of numbers, and because they're growing fastest in the parts of the world which are really growing fastest. We might also reflect on things like the last US election and Brexit to think about whether or not smaller places, which wouldn't describe themselves as peri-urban, but bear many of the hallmarks that we would think of as peri-urban, aren't increasingly part of a second tier of urbanism, a kind of second-class urbanism, if you like. Not sexy, not integrated, not global. And that's probably got lots of political implications as well as administrative and fiscal ones. And certainly in the context of Africa, which is where the term peri-urban is used. I think those of you who are Indian specialists use the term peri-urban as well, although but not quite as much as they do in the African context. And in Africa, the peri-urban space is one that is really difficult to understand because almost always there's no formal local government. And that's really difficult because it means that there's no obvious accountability, there's no obvious capacity for some of the kinds of urban management questions, and there's no urban rule of law. And by that I don't mean just on controls or development controls, but just basic forward planning, things that we might think of as zoning, but are general principles of forward planning. Where are we going to put the infrastructure? So peri-urban development is the most important place in terms of rapid growth, especially in areas where there are a lot of poor people. There are quite often places that are left out of the national psyche and the global psyche, so they aren't as powerful in shaping the vision of the city. And critically, the kinds of institutions that we need in order to make them work, just basically as small towns, okay, just aren't in place. And so very difficult in terms of the sustainable development goals. Having said that, it does seem to me that there are also easier places. Now, that sounds contradictory, but why do I say that? I say that because I think some of the technology leapfrogging that we are excited about, renewables, off-grid water provision, urban agriculture, any number of the biodiversity, good biodiversity corridors, any number of those sorts of things are actually a lot easier to achieve. Sustainable transport, good biking. With effective planning, it's really, really easy to make those places very livable. I think the technology options, where you don't deal with quite so many people with such high volumes and with such complex systems are probably simpler. So I don't think it's all bad news, but a conscious strategy, yeah, that is really important there. So yeah, I'm looking down the questions there. Jeff's asked me to talk a little bit more about public and private. Jeff, can I make that a bigger question, if you like? Because I think that, and it goes back to our earlier question that Singh had about how do we think about the city, and because the city is such a complex place, and the idea that I'm very excited about at the moment is the idea not so much of public versus private, formal versus informal, but rather that we begin to look at the interface of these things. Okay, in other words, not just how do we bring things together, or should we go for A versus B, private or public, but rather that we understand how they connect. Okay, so give you a really good example. When people put in place big PPPs, public-private partnerships, on things like water provision, happened across the world, okay, there was almost no attention given to the capacity of the local government to manage the contracts for the outsourcing that they were doing. And so an awful lot of the critiques which came forward were about how awful private provision was, and they were, in delivering to the poor, okay? And the critique was that that was because you had greedy corporates who were taking all the money. And that may have been the case, but it was also absolutely the case that when the contracts were put in place, it was perfectly possible to ensure that the same kinds of cross-subsidies or better capacity to cross-subsidize would be put in place. But the state had no capacity to manage that. It also didn't look effectively at the kinds of things where you would want to say, in order to maintain an effective relationship between different parties, informal sector traders, formal supermarkets is an example in the food sector, we have to understand what the points of connection are between these. So, basic example, the way that the food system is often thought of in the city is people say, well, it's either big supermarkets or it's the woman selling bananas on the side of the road. And it seems to me it's never like that, okay? Good cities work well when there's a happy interface between those different elements and the mediation in a sense of the power. And that for me that goes back to that point about what do we want states to do. That at the end of the day is the thing that we want the state to do. We want it to actually look at those mechanisms that it might include in order to ensure sustainable development. And that's what the global system is trying to do. Okay? Whether we get there or not is a different point. But we're saying there are things that we want. We want you to try and make sure that there's sustainability in the system and that there's development. And it's less prescriptive than about who or what. So, yeah, that would be the thing for me on the public and the private. I've been asked to go back to a couple of things and just try and be a little bit more specific. And I think it was my hesitation on the literature on resilience. And the suggestion, I remember I said that there was a critique of resilience because people felt that it didn't look adequately at power. So there are a number of different critiques of resilience, okay? So its inability, so to be crude, what people argue is that you can have a perfectly resilient system and it can be resilient precisely because elites are good at reconfiguring and reestablishing their power. And here, yeah, I used the example of a good example of a corporate. Let's use a bad example of a corporate. Corporates are or are accused of actually knowing exactly how much money that they can extract. So when there are food riots, food prices will drop in order to ensure that there is still a sale of food. And so resilient systems, the idea of resilience is that it is a system that kind of self-regulates, generally does so in the interests of those who have power. And so the argument is that just because something survives and is able to self-correct, it doesn't mean that it is in fact a good thing. So yeah, I hope that clarifies that a bit. I'm just looking back to see if there are any issues which we've left out. And the one question which was asked, which I skipped, and I'm sorry, but I think we have actually covered, is the question of what do I mean by fair city? We've just actually put a book out on that, and it's free, open access. So if you want to download it, you can. And it's edited by David Simon. And I think it's called something like Fair, Green, and Compact. But if you Google David Simon and Susan Parnell, it's a free open access book, and you can download the chapter on what I mean by fair, and it'll give you a fairly detailed understanding. But the summary version of that is that I like the idea that it doesn't matter whether you were born rich or poor, black or white, man or woman, gay or straight, that your life chances in the city are not predetermined. And there are many, many different ways that we can mediate what are undoubtedly the unfair dimensions of urban living by reflecting on what can be done, whether it's through redistribution, whether it's through spatial planning, whether it's through political organizing, an enormous number of those things. And so that chapter actually begins to set those out. And I hope that you can have a look at that there. So, but colleagues, it's just you've seen from the range of questions that we've had, is that it seems to me that what we've all been trying to do is to grapple with different parts of what is a tremendously exciting, very demanding, contextually quite different applications of the ability to think about the city, to think about cityness, to think about the city in the sustainable development context. But we won't all get there on our own. I think that we can say authoritatively that it's too hard, it's too big, and we absolutely have to work together. We probably won't work in ways that are utterly harmonious. And so, to go back to the point we made in the lecture, understanding our own contribution, what its limits are, and where it may contribute to something which is bigger or contradict what others are putting forward, is a probably more useful way to go than to try and be quite superficial, because we skim over what are really quite complex and difficult dynamics, which relate to the most important spaces in which we all live, and which are ultimately going to determine the future of our cities. So yeah, good luck with the rest of the course, and I hope at some point to connect with some of you in one or another way and place. So I hope you found the questions useful, and you will pick up on these issues as you go forward into other modules. And my point about relating this, particularly the question about theory and history, to the other modules is crucial. So thanks everybody. Bye-bye.